London 1830s, a city choking on smoke and sin. By day the streets reek of sweat and coal. By night they glow with gold, the light of the gin palaces. Behind crystal windows, the poor drink like kings, drowning misery in rivers of clear fire. Laughter echoes through marble halls while outside, hunger waits in the rain. These weren't just bars, they were cathedrals of escape, temples to forgetfulness, shining in a world without mercy. Step inside, and you'll see it too. The glitter, the ruin, and the city that learned to hide its pain in glass. The air shimmered with candlelight and the sweet, sharp scent of gin. Beneath the fog-drenched streets of 19th century London, where the poor stumbled through alleys and the rich rode in carriages, a revolution was brewing, not in Parliament, but in glass. The Gin Palace, they called it. To some, it was a temple of pleasure, to others, a pit of sin, but to all, it was irresistible. If you walked through London in 1830, you couldn't miss it. The glow spilling from grand windows, the laughter that cut through the chill, and the unmistakable clink of glasses. Inside, beneath gilded mirrors and gas lamps, men and women from every corner of society drank away their misery, their morality, and often their lives. But this was no ordinary tavern. The Gin Palace was something new, something shocking. It was the child of industrial progress and urban despair. A glittering mirage built over the bones of a broken city. London at the dawn of the 19th century was choking on itself. The Industrial Revolution had drawn millions from the countryside into a city that was never ready for them. Slums stretched for miles, packed with families who slept six to a room. The Thames stank with sewage, the streets with sweat and despair. Amid this chaos, gin became the people's medicine, cheap, strong, and mercifully fast. By the 1830s, the government had relaxed restrictions on distilling, and gin was once again flowing freely through the city's veins. But something had changed. The crude, filthy dram shops of the previous century had evolved into palaces, lavish, dazzling spaces that looked more like theaters than bars. Marble counters replaced wooden ones. Chandeliers replaced candles. Painted mirrors reflected endless illusions of luxury, giving even the poorest drinker the sense, if only for a moment, of being somewhere grand. For a penny, you could buy oblivion. For another, you could forget who you were. To the reformers and moralists, these establishments were dens of degradation. To the people, they were an escape from the relentless grind of survival. The gin palaces stood like cathedrals on every corner, their brass fittings polished, their windows blazing with light, their customers spilling into the night in a haze of laughter, song, and ruin. A traveler once wrote that entering a gin palace was like stepping into the belly of a star. Everything glittered. Everything promised warmth, and yet, beneath the laughter and the glow, there was darkness, a quiet despair that even the brightest chandeliers couldn't mask. Here in these gilded halls, London revealed its contradictions. Respectable clerks stood shoulder to shoulder with pickpockets. Housewives drank beside prostitutes. The boundaries of class blurred beneath the haze of intoxication. It was a democracy of vice, and for many, it was the only one they would ever know. But the cost was steep. Gin was not just a drink, it was an anesthetic for the human condition. Mothers pawned their wedding rings for a bottle. Children went hungry while fathers drank their wages dry. And yet, every night, the palaces gleamed, their doors open wide, their bartenders moving like priests at an altar, serving salvation one glass at a time. It was said that gin didn't just numb the pain, it created a new kind of society, one no longer governed by order or decency, but by the rhythm of intoxication. When the gin ran out, fights broke out. When the lamps dimmed, the streets filled with staggering silhouettes. Women in torn dresses, men with bloodied faces, all chasing the last drop of euphoria before dawn. Artists and writers began to take notice. Charles Dickens, ever the chronicler of London's soul, called gin palaces beautiful but terrible. He saw them for what they were, a seductive illusion built on misery, and yet, even he couldn't deny their strange beauty. The architecture of these palaces became a reflection of the times. Ornate facades and glittering interiors spoke of ambition, of progress, of the illusion that poverty could be escaped through spectacle. They were the early prototypes of what would become the nightlife industry, a blend of commerce, addiction, and fantasy. And behind the counter, another figure reigned, the bartender, part salesman, part confident, part confessor. He knew the names of his regulars, their debts, their secrets. He was the silent observer of London's descent into intoxicated madness. But even as the gin flowed freely, the empire outside was expanding. Ships sailed from London's docks to every corner of the world, carrying tea, sugar, tobacco, and the very molasses used to distill the gin that kept the city drunk. The empire fed its people's thirst, and the people's thirst fed the empire. In this shimmering contradiction, the gin palace became both a symbol of modernity and decay, a dazzling mask over a diseased face. The working man drank to forget his labor. The woman drank to forget her loneliness. The rich drank to feel alive among the poor, and the poor drank to feel rich among the dead. Every night, London's gin palaces became theatres of human frailty. Behind the laughter and music, there was always someone crying softly in a corner. Behind the gleaming counters, someone was counting coins for the morgue. And outside, beneath the flickering gas lamps, another generation stumbled toward the same fate. The gin palace wasn't just a building. It was an idea, one that captured the spirit of an age that mistook intoxication for progress. And it was only just beginning. Step closer. The heavy doors swing open and the noise hits like a wave. Inside, the air is thick with the perfume of juniper, tobacco smoke, and sweat. Gas lamps hiss above the crowd, their yellow glow glinting off brass fixtures and crystal decanters. The bar counter gleams like a golden altar, stretching the length of the room, crowded with hands clutching coins and cups. A woman in a tattered shawl leans forward, her eyes glassy. "A penny gin," she slurs. The bartender nods, fills a small glass from a shining tap, and slides it across the counter. The liquid catches the light, clear as water, deadly as poison. She drinks it in one motion, shivers, then laughs as if she's been reborn. This is the heart of a London gin palace, circa 1840, a world where time melts beneath the weight of intoxication. The architecture itself feels alive. Mirrors line the walls, multiplying every flicker of light until the room seems infinite. Ornate columns rise like marble trees, supporting a ceiling painted with angels and vines. The illusion is total. Even the poorest soul feels like royalty for a fleeting moment. Behind the counter, attendants in crisp white shirts move like clockwork, pouring, polishing, collecting coins. The efficiency is hypnotic. A drunkard collapses against the bar, muttering, "Just one more." And one more is always given. At the back of the room, a small group sings an old sailor's tune, their voices echoing through the haze. Beside them, a pair of factory girls giggle over their drinks, their cheeks flushed red. A constable peeks in from the street, sighs, and walks away. He's seen this scene 1,000 times. These palaces were not just drinking houses, they were a stage, a spectacle, a dream that cost only a few pennies. The rise of these establishments was no accident. The industrial boom had filled London with the working class. Men who spent 12 hours in factories, women who toiled as laundresses or seamstresses for pennies a day. They came home to damp rooms and hungry mouths. The gin palace offered them something else: a light, music, and escape. The wealthy architects and distillers knew exactly what they were doing. They built temples for the masses, bright, beautiful, and dangerous. Gin was cheap to make and easy to sell. With every new palace, profits soared. But for all its glitter, the gin palace had a dark heartbeat. Beneath the polished mahogany counters, lies were told, debts made, and lives ruined. The regulars came not for joy, but for relief. Gin didn't heal their pain, It just made it shimmer for a while. One journalist in 1835 described entering a gin palace as stepping into a paradise of glass and gaslight, where the devil himself serves drinks. In one corner, a mother rocks her infant, feeding it a few drops of gin from a rag to keep it quiet. Across from her, two dockworkers argue over wages, their voices rising until one smashes a bottle. Blood and liquor mix on the floor. The crowd barely notices. This was the paradox of London's gin palaces: beauty on the surface, misery beneath. Even as reformers called them dens of degradation, they continued to spread. By the 1850s, London boasted more than 5,000 gin establishments, many open all night. Each one competed for attention. Larger mirrors, brighter lights, cheaper prices. They were the neon lights of the Victorian age. To the social elite, these palaces were both fascination and fear. Gentlemen would sometimes visit incognito, drawn by the exotic thrill of mingling with the underclass. The experience was electric, dangerous, seductive, alive. But they always left before midnight, before the glamour turned to chaos. Writers began to capture the atmosphere. Dickens, in Sketches by Boz, described how even the poor were enchanted. The bright gaslight burns up against the ceiling. The painted walls reflect the radiance, the mirrors sparkle, and the glasses shine. Yet for every glittering reflection, there was a shadow. Outside, the streets were littered with empty bottles and unconscious bodies. The alleyways behind the palaces became silent graveyards of those who drunk themselves past memory. Still, the city couldn't look away. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Gin brands like Booth's, Gordon's, and Nicholson's rose to prominence, each selling purity and refinement, as if their product were a tonic of civilization rather than destruction. Advertisements painted gin as the modern choice, the drink of progress. The irony was cruel. For the working poor, progress meant more hours, less food, and stronger gin. As one reformer wrote, "London drinks because London suffers." The palaces became both symptom and sanctuary. Every night, they filled with laughter that bordered on madness, joy that bordered on despair. Couples danced, workers sang, and the city forgot its pain for a few shimmering hours. And then morning came. The lamps went out. The marble counters, once glowing with reflected light, now looked cold and grey. The patrons stumbled into the streets, squinting against the dawn. The illusion faded, hunger returned, and yet, by evening, the same faces would be back, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. For all their grandeur, the gin palaces were machines of repetition, of escape, collapse, and return. And London, ever hungry for spectacle, kept building more. As the 1840s slipped into the 1850s, the gin palace was no longer just a drinking house. It was becoming something bigger, a stage upon which the great performance of urban life unfolded. Every evening, as gas lamps flickered awake across the city, London's working men and women drifted toward these luminous shrines. The streets outside were dark and damp, but inside, the light dazzled like a promise. It wasn't just about gin anymore. It was about belonging. In an age of soot and smog, where most homes were one room and most lives were one struggle, the gin palace offered colour, conversation, and spectacle. It was the people's theatre. You didn't need a ticket, only a few coins and a thirst for forgetting. The architecture told its own story. Gilded mirrors, marble counters, chandeliers dripping with light, all borrowed from the language of wealth. The palaces mimicked the drawing rooms of the upper class, offering the poor a taste of refinement, even if just for an hour. A dockworker might sit beside a washerwoman, a chimney sweep beside a clerk, and for a fleeting moment, the boundaries of class blurred in the shimmer of the gin glass. Music played a vital role in this transformation. In the corner, a fiddle screeched out a lively jig. Later, an upright piano appeared, brought in by an enterprising owner who discovered that music made people drink more. Soon songs filled the air, folk ballads, sailors' chants, and bawdy tunes about landlords and lovers. The laughter grew louder as the drinks kept flowing. The Gin Palace had become London's first nightlife hub. A place not just to drink, but to live out the fantasies that the harsh daylight suppressed. And with this rise came a strange new culture of fashion. Women who worked in sweatshops by day appeared at night in cheap satin and imitation pearls, their faces powdered, their hair pinned with coloured ribbons. They called themselves gin queens, ruling their little courts with laughter and liquor. Men, too, played the part. They wore second-hand waistcoats and shiny boots, their hats tilted with an air of pride. For a few hours, they weren't labourers or beggars. They were lords of their own smoky kingdoms. This wasn't just drinking, it was transformation, eh? And that was precisely what frightened the moral guardians of Victorian England. Newspapers began to wage war against the gin palaces, calling them temples of depravity and the new plague of London. Pamphlets circulated with grim illustrations of drunken mothers, neglected children, and families ruined by gin. One famous print, titled "The Drunkard's Progress," showed a man taking his first drink in a palace, then descending step by step into madness, poverty, and finally the gallows. But condemnation only fueled curiosity. The more the middle class warned against the dangers of gin, the more the working class embraced it as a badge of defiance. In their eyes, the palaces weren't places of sin, they were spaces of freedom. No overseer, no landlord, no judgment, just laughter, light, and a glass that never stayed empty for long. And yet, there was an unease that hung in the air, invisible but palpable. Reformers noticed it, writers sensed it, and even the patrons, in their quieter moments, felt it too. For beneath the music and the glow was an unmistakable truth: these palaces offered escape, not change. The gin dulled the pain, but it didn't heal the wound. As night turned to morning, and the gaslights dimmed, the illusion cracked. The glamour was only ever skin deep. Beneath it lay exhaustion, addiction, and poverty waiting outside the door. Still, the palaces kept spreading. Their success was unstoppable. Architects competed to outdo each other with ever more ornate designs. One new establishment on Holborn Viaduct was described as a cathedral of intoxication, with carved pillars, gold leaf ceilings, and a fountain that poured gin instead of water. It was absurd, magnificent, and deeply tragic, the perfect mirror of London itself. By the mid-19th century, even visitors from abroad were stunned. An American journalist wrote, "The Gin Palace of London glows like a gem in the grime, a house of worship where the people kneel not to God, but to their own forgetting." The empire was expanding, industry booming, and the city growing richer by the year. But for those who laboured beneath that progress, the Gin Palace remained the only place where the illusion of joy was affordable. A penny for relief, a shilling for oblivion. And while politicians debated reforms, while churches preached temperance, while doctors warned of delirium tremens, London kept drinking. Night after night, thousands poured into the glowing palaces, their laughter echoing through the narrow streets. The city pulsed with intoxication, and the question lingered in the smoky air. Was gin destroying London, or was it simply numbing a pain the city refused to face? By the 1850s, the Gin Palace had become the beating, drunken heart of London, but not everyone was enchanted by its glow. In the quiet halls of churches and Parliament buildings, a different kind of fervour was brewing. The moral outrage of a society terrified of its own reflection. Every week, the newspapers printed lurid tales: mothers poisoning their infants with gin-soaked milk, labourers drinking their wages before dawn, women selling their dignity for a single glass. The city, it seemed, was intoxicated, not just with liquor, but with its own decay. Reformers began to rise. They called themselves the temperance movement, and they spoke with the fire of prophets. They saw the Gin Palace not as a place of pleasure, but as a factory of ruin, an engine that turned poverty into profit and despair into entertainment. Pamphlets were distributed by candlelight. One read, Every drop of gin is distilled from the tears of the poor. Preachers thundered from pulpits, warning that the city was selling its soul for a sip of juniper. The devil, one pastor proclaimed, no longer hides in shadows. He lights gas lamps on every street and calls himself the landlord. The women played a central role in this crusade. Mothers who had lost sons to drink, wives who had buried their husbands in gin-soaked graves. They marched through the streets carrying banners that read, total abstinence or total ruin. At first, the palaces laughed. Their owners were powerful, their patrons loyal, and the money endless. But then something strange began to happen. The moral panic became fashionable. The middle class, eager to prove its virtue, embraced sobriety as a social statement. Tea parties replaced taverns. Coffeehouses filled with poets and preachers debating the sins of the bottle. Even Queen Victoria herself, though discreetly, supported the movement toward moderation. The working class, however, had no such luxury. A cup of tea could not ease the pain of 14-hour shifts or feed a starving child. For them, gin remained the one medicine the system allowed. The reformers were right, but they were also blind. They saw vice, but not the hunger behind it. They condemned the drunkard, but ignored the factory that paid him pennies. They scorned the mother who drank, but not the landlord who charged her double rent. So, while the sermons thundered, the palaces kept filling. Still, pressure mounted. Licensing laws were tightened. Police patrols increased. Tavern keepers were fined for serving the intoxicated. But enforcement was almost impossible. There were simply too many drinkers, too many bars, too much profit. And gin had become part of London's bloodstream. In a desperate attempt to compete, owners turned their palaces into even grander spectacles. They added ornate balconies, colored glass ceilings, carved cherubs, and electric lighting as it became available. The more the moralists shouted, the brighter the gin palaces shone. It became a war of aesthetics, light against shadow, virtue against vice. And yet, in the midst of this battle, there were quiet tragedies that never made the papers. Take Mary Linton, a laundress from Spitalfields, who earned 6p a day washing other people's clothes. She spent half her earnings on gin, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't bear the silence of her cold, rented room. One evening, she was found asleep against the wall of a gin palace, her baby in her arms, both of them still. The coroner called it accidental. The papers didn't print her name. There were thousands like her, anonymous ghosts in London's great intoxication. And yet the palaces thrived. For every tragedy, there was laughter. For every sermon, a song. The sound of music and clinking glasses carried through the fog, drowning out the moral outrage with melody. The reformers could not fight the rhythm of the city. In the back streets of Whitechapel and Limehouse, the gin flowed like water. Even when taxes rose and police raided the taverns, new ones appeared overnight. The hunger for escape was stronger than any law. Writers captured this contradiction, the moral crusade versus the human need for pleasure. Dickens wrote of the cursed charm of gin, while social critics called it the invisible hand that strangles the poor. But to the people inside the palaces, it was simpler than all that. They weren't thinking of morality or politics. They were thinking of warmth, light, laughter, and that first burning sip that made everything else fade. London was a city that both condemned and depended on its own vices. As one observer wrote, "The gin palace is both the symptom and the salve of a sick civilization." And though the reformers fought with pamphlets, laws, and prayers, they could never truly compete with the intoxicating glow that poured from every glass window on a London night. By the middle of the 19th century, something unexpected had happened. What began as a desperate escape for the working class had become the aesthetic heartbeat of a modern empire. The gin palace, once condemned as a den of vice, was now shaping London's very identity. Architects studied them with fascination. The mirrored walls, The grand staircases, the theatrical lighting. All of it began to influence the design of theatres, hotels, and even railway stations. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. People wanted beauty, even in places built for sin. The working man's gin palace had done what sermons and politics never could. It gave the poor a taste for splendor. Soon, respectable society followed. New establishments appeared, brighter, bigger, and slightly more refined, calling themselves refreshment halls or spirit saloons. They mimicked the style of the gin palaces, but replaced the rough crowds with gentlemen in waistcoats and women in silk gloves. The line between high and low blurred. London was learning to drink in style. Painters captured the phenomenon. In smoky studios, artists like Gustave Doré and George Cruikshank sketched the luminous interiors of gin palaces. Women laughing under chandeliers. Men sprawled in stupors, children peering through the windows in awe. These images became iconic, both seductive and horrifying. Cruikshank, who had once been a heavy drinker himself, turned temperance advocate. His famous engraving, The Worship of Bacchus, showed a monstrous figure of wine and gin towering over London, worshipped by thousands of drunken souls. It was art as warning, and yet it was beautiful. That was the irony of the gin palace. Even its critics couldn't help but romanticize it. Writers, too, found inspiration in its glow. Dickens, Thackeray, and later even Oscar Wilde wrote of the city's intoxicated nights. In their stories, the gin palace became a symbol of urban duality. Light and shadow, luxury and ruin, laughter and despair. It wasn't just a building. It was a mirror, reflecting everything London wanted to hide and everything it secretly adored. The gaslight became the icon of the age. Its soft golden hue transformed the streets at night, turning filth into magic. People began to associate that light, the flickering, shimmering glow of the gin palace, with modernity itself. Without realizing it, London was inventing the nightlife we know today. Crowds poured into these establishments after work, seeking company, music, and spectacle. The first pub concerts appeared, rough songs at first, then polished performances. From these smoky back rooms, the music hall was born, a direct descendant of the gin palace stage. By the 1870s, these music halls became empires of entertainment, hosting comedians, singers, and dancers. The people who once stumbled drunk out of gin palaces now paid to watch laughter performed under stage lights. The spirit of the gin palace, its hunger for brightness and escape, had evolved into the DNA of modern show business. Even fashion followed the same rhythm. The reflective surfaces, the glittering jewelry, the fascination with glass and shimmer, all echoed the world of gin palaces. They made the aesthetic of intoxication glamorous. For the first time, decadence became a culture. Of course, the moralists were horrified. They accused the palaces of corrupting art and dulling virtue, of making poverty seem picturesque. But they couldn't stop it, because the gin palace represented something much deeper than drunkenness. It represented the human refusal to live in darkness. The poorest Londoners didn't visit for the taste of gin. They came for the light, the sound, the illusion of belonging. They came to feel human again in a city that treated them like shadows. Inside those mirrored walls, the illusion was perfect. You could forget your hunger, your debts, your insignificance. You could look at your reflection, multiplied endlessly, and almost believe you mattered. And perhaps that was the most dangerous intoxication of all. By now, the gin palace was as much a part of London as its fog, its cobblestones, its gas lamps. Tourists marveled at them. Foreign writers described the city's liquid paradise. Even reformers, while condemning, admitted that London without its gin palaces would lose a piece of its soul, because they weren't just bars. They were the beating heart of modern desire, a physical manifestation of the eternal human need to find beauty in pain. One French visitor wrote in 1865, "Londoners drink not because they are wicked, but because their world demands forgetting." The Jinn Palace gives them mercy when their god does not. By the late century, Jinn's reputation softened again. It was rebranded, refined, and romanticized. Advertisements painted it as the drink of sophistication, a far cry from the days of ruinous poverty. But its origin never disappeared. Behind every elegant label was the memory of the slums, the music, the flickering gaslight over the crowd. The Jinn Palace had changed everything, from architecture to nightlife, from fashion to feeling. London had built a temple to intoxication, and in doing so, had found the architecture of escape. By the last decades of the 19th century, the golden age of the Jinn Palace was beginning to fade. But it did not die quietly. London had changed. The fog was still thick, the poverty still real, but the city had grown more complex, industrialized, mechanized, and slightly more self-conscious. Progress was the new intoxication. The moral crusades had left their mark. Laws restricting the sale of gin tightened, taxes rose, and the government introduced closing hours to limit all night drinking. No longer could the poor find refuge in endless, gaslit nights. The palaces began to dim. In some areas, owners tore down their glass facades, replacing mirrors with wood and brass. Trying to look respectable, others rebranded entirely, calling themselves public houses or gin halls, hoping to hide their past under new names. The word palace itself began to feel dangerous, too decadent, too scandalous for an empire that now prided itself on morality and order. But even as the grandeur faded, the soul of the Jinn Palace lingered in the walls. The laughter had quieted, but you could still feel it. The echo of glasses clinking, the hum of songs once sung by men who'd long since vanished into the fog. Meanwhile, new pleasures were arriving. The working class discovered the music hall, the theatre, and later, the cinema. These offered a different kind of escape. One that didn't demand intoxication, only a ticket and imagination. Electricity replaced gaslight. The once magical glow of the Jinn Palace became ordinary, no longer a miracle. Just another light in a city full of them. And as the lights lost their power, so too did the spell. Gin itself began to change. Distillers refined their recipes, removed impurities, and marketed the drink as something modern, even sophisticated. By the 1890s, gin wasn't the poor man's poison anymore. It was the gentleman's aperitif. The same liquid that had drowned London's misery was now being served in cut, crystal glasses at garden parties. The city had rewritten its own addiction. But for the ghosts of the old palaces, the washerwomen, the factory men, the soldiers on leave, their world was already gone. One by one, the great establishments closed. The mirrors cracked. The marble counters were sold, the chandeliers dismantled. Some buildings became grocery stores or lodging houses. Others simply collapsed, their beauty forgotten beneath soot and progress. A few survived, though transformed beyond recognition. If you walk through Holborn or Clerkenwell today, you can still spot the remnants. A carved column here, a mosaic floor there. The faint curve of an arched window that once framed the glow of gin. The modern London pub, with its polished brass taps and warm light, is their descendant, quieter, cleaner, but carrying the same soul, the same need to gather, to drink, to forget for a while. The temperance movement had won some victories. Fewer deaths, stricter licensing, a culture that prized moderation. But even they could not erase the truth. The Jinn Palace had changed the very rhythm of the city. It had taught London how to live at night. Before the palace's darkness belonged to thieves and beggars. After them, it belonged to music, laughter, and light. The concept of nightlife, of streets alive after dusk, began here in those glass-walled temples of intoxication. And so, even in their decline, the Jinn Palaces achieved immortality. They were more than places to drink. They were the first cathedrals of escape in a modern world, built on exhaustion. They gave a generation of the forgotten something rare, a feeling of beauty, even if bought by the glass. Reformers could outlaw gin, but not the human desire to dream. By the time Queen Victoria's reign ended, London had entered a new age, one of electricity, empire, and etiquette. The moralists congratulated themselves on their victories. The streets, they said, were cleaner now. But if you listened carefully, you could still hear the faint echo of a piano from some forgotten basement, a tune from a time when the city was drunk on its own contradictions. The Gin Palace era had passed, but it had left behind an inheritance. No one could destroy a culture of light, spectacle, and escape that would ripple through the 20th century into cabarets, dance halls, and cocktail bars. The working man's gin had become the world's leisure. And though the mirrors were gone, London would never stop chasing its own reflection in the glass. The barmaid, her name could have been Annie, or Mary, or Rose. They were all the same, really. Young women with tired eyes and quick smiles, standing behind mahogany counters for 12 hours straight. The barmaids were the true queens of the Gin Palace. Men called them angels, sirens, sweethearts, but they were workers, not muses. They juggled heavy glassware, flirted to keep the tips flowing, and dodged hands that lingered too long. Some came from the countryside, drawn by the promise of London's glow. Others had nowhere else to go. Widows, orphans, runaways. They lived in cramped rooms above the bar, their hair always smelling faintly of juniper and smoke. The newspapers of the time loved to gossip about them. The temptresses of the gin palaces, they wrote, as if these women were part of the moral decay. But if you'd watched closely, you'd see the truth. They were survivors, not seducers. For every man who staggered out into the cold, it was the barmaid who stayed behind, cleaning the counters and counting the coins that would barely pay her rent. Some barmaids married well, others vanished, swallowed by the city's appetite for the young and the poor. Yet they became symbols of the age, the human face of London's addiction to both gin and glamour. The drinker then, there was Thomas, a dock worker. He came every night after the shifts ended, hands still raw from hauling rope. He never caused trouble. He'd sit in the same corner, order one glass, then another, until the world stopped spinning just enough to make him forget his empty flat. For men like Thomas, gin wasn't a luxury, it was anesthesia. It numbed the body, softened the edges of hunger and humiliation. When reformers called him a sinner, he laughed. What did they know of a man who broke his back for pennies? Whose only warmth came from the gaslight's yellow glow? He wasn't drinking to rebel. He was drinking to survive. And in that small glass he found mercy. The reformer, but outside, on the frozen pavement, stood another figure, Mrs. Caldwell, a widow in her 50s, clutching pamphlets that read, "Drink is the devil's door." She had lost her husband to gin. And every night, she stood outside the palaces with her little lamp, warning passers-by not to enter. Her eyes burned with a strange light, part faith, part fury. To her, every mirror inside was a portal to ruin. Every song sung by drunk men was a funeral hymn. And yet, she couldn't help but glance through the window sometimes. The chandeliers sparkled, the people laughed. The barmaids smiled, and for a moment, even she felt the pull of that forbidden beauty. She prayed harder after that. The owner, Mr. Finch, the proprietor, was no villain. He was a businessman, practical, calculating. He'd started as a waiter, saved every coin, and now ran one of the largest establishments in Clerkenwell. He saw himself as a benefactor of the poor. "Better they drink in my clean, well-lit house," he'd say, "than rot in the gutters." He paid his girls fairly, kept his floors spotless, and threw out troublemakers. But he also knew the truth: his fortune was built on desperation. Every morning, he'd walk through the silent hall before opening hours. The chandeliers hung still, the air smelled faintly of stale gin and soap. He'd stare at the empty glasses, thousands of them gleaming like ghosts, and feel something twist inside. He'd built a palace of light in a city of shadows, but sometimes he wondered if the shadows were winning. the stranger, and then there was her. A foreign writer, perhaps French or American, notebook in hand, sitting quietly at the corner table. She watched the spectacle unfold each night. The noise, the songs, the laughter and tears. To her, the Gin Palace was London in miniature. Beauty and decay, side by side. She would later write of it, not as scandal or tragedy, but as poetry. Of how the chandeliers made beggars look like kings. How a glass of gin could turn suffering into art. Maybe her name was unknown. Maybe she never published a word. But in that moment, she understood something timeless. That even in their misery, the people of London had style. They turned poverty into theatre. And gin, that cruel, clear liquid, was both the poison and the performance. When the last candle burned out and the door finally closed, only silence remained. But in that silence was something eternal. The heartbeat of a city that had learned to endure through illusion. Every sip, every song, every flicker of gaslight had been a small act of rebellion against despair. That's what the gin palaces really were. Not just places to drink, but places to feel alive, even if only for one more night. When the 19th century drew its weary breath, London had changed. The air that once shimmered with laughter and gin fumes had begun to smell of reform, progress, and something colder, respectability. The gin palaces, once the fiery heart of working class escape, now stood as both monuments and warnings. To some, they were the tombstones of a sinful past. To others, they were relics of a time when even misery had music. The moral reckoning, by the 1870s, reformers had found their voice. The temperance movement, once mocked as a fringe crusade, now marched through London streets with banners reading, "Drink is the demon, family is the cure." Churches filled their pulpits with sermons condemning gin as the mother of all vices. Pamphlets flooded the city. Stories of ruined men, broken homes and barmaids turned to shame. And while some of those tales were exaggerated, many were heartbreakingly true. The newspapers published sketches of the poor. Children with hollow eyes standing outside taverns. Wives waiting in the rain for husbands who would never come home sober. It was moral theatre, yes, but it struck a nerve. Victorian London, once drunk on its own industrial glory, suddenly felt guilty about what it had created. The age of indulgence was giving way to the age of restraint. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. For every preacher who condemned the gin palace, there was a poet who missed it. A writer who saw beauty in its chaos, music in its ruin. Art in the shadows. Artists were the first to feel it. That strange nostalgia for decadence. Painters began to capture the last days of the gin palaces, their golden light fading behind dirty glass. Writers, too, took up the task of remembering. Charles Dickens had already written of London's drink-soaked despair, but others, poets like Ernest Dowson, playwrights like Arthur Wing Pinero, began to speak of the intoxication itself, not just the tragedy. The gin palace became a metaphor for temptation, for art, for the fleeting joy of the lower classes. Even Oscar Wilde, in his glittering cynicism, admired the theatre of the poor. He once said that one should either be a work of art or wear a work of art. And in a strange way, the gin palaces had done both. They dressed misery in chandeliers and made loneliness look beautiful. The birth of nightlife as the century turned. The gin palaces began to evolve. The working class drinkers gave way to the middle class. The wooden counters replaced by marble. The gaslight by electricity. By the early 1900s, the gin palace had become something else entirely. The public house, the bar, the music hall. Out of its ashes rose the nightlife of modern Britain. Jazz and cabaret would later fill the spaces once haunted by gin-soaked silence. The people still came to forget their troubles, but now they called it entertainment. The spirit of the gin palace didn't die. It changed its costume. It became more respectable, more polished, but beneath the polished brass and polite laughter, the same yearning lingered. The human need to escape. The survivors, a few of the old palaces, survived into the 20th century. If you walked through London in 1910, you might still find one glowing on a corner, its mirrors dulled by dust, its chandeliers swaying faintly with age. Inside, the faces had changed, but the stories had not. The dock worker had become a clerk. The barmaid now wore silk instead of linen. The gin was poured into cleaner glasses. Yet when the lights dimmed and the songs began, it was as if time folded back, and the ghosts of the 1840s returned, laughing in the golden haze. The city that forgot London forgot, of course, cities always do. By the 1920s, gin was no longer scandalous. It was chic, served in crystal, sipped by flappers, paired with jazz. The drink that once symbolized the ruin of the poor had become the pleasure of the rich. It was a full circle irony, one that history rarely admits. The vice of one class becomes the fashion of another. The poor had been punished for what the rich later celebrated. And somewhere in the city's deep memory, the ghosts of the old gin palaces must have smiled bitterly. The eternal hangover, even as modern bars replaced the palaces, something lingered. The rhythm of the old gin halls. The noise, the laughter, the ache, still beat beneath London's nightlife. Every neon sign, every glass raised in celebration, owed a silent debt to those smoky, mirrored dens of the past. Because the gin palaces were never really about alcohol. They were about escape. And that need to step outside of reality for just one night, is as old as the city itself. As the last of the old palaces closed their doors, London's streets grew quieter, but its soul remained restless. The city moved on. But beneath the asphalt and steel, beneath the glass towers and cocktail bars, you can still hear the faint echo of a piano, the laughter of a barmaid, and the clinking of 1,000 forgotten glasses. A toast to the poor, the drunk, the dreamers, and the palaces that gave them, for one fleeting night, the illusion of paradise. When the lights of the gin palaces finally went out, their glow didn't die. It simply moved. It burned quietly in the British mind, becoming something deeper than a habit. It became heritage. The gin palace was more than a building. It was a mirror, reflecting the contradictions of an empire that wanted both restraint and indulgence, morality and pleasure, virtue and vice. The class divide that never left. In Victorian England, gin had been the drink of the poor. It was called mother's ruin, the working man's poison, a moral infection of the lower orders. But by the early 20th century, that same clear liquid was reborn, now served in cut crystal, garnished with cucumber, and sipped by aristocrats at Mayfair balls. The hypocrisy was staggering, but also perfectly British. The same society that once passed laws to curb the working classes' drinking, now toasted their own success with the very spirit they had condemned. Gin had ascended the social ladder, and in doing so, it carried with it the memory of the slums it once haunted. The drink had become a silent rebellion, a reminder that class boundaries could blur in the fog of intoxication. Because inside a gin palace, everyone, rich or poor, pious or wicked, drank under the same golden light. Even today, when you see Londoners in a sleek bar clinking glasses of gin and tonic, you're seeing the ghosts of that rebellion still at play. A drink once used to forget suffering is now used to celebrate success. But both acts come from the same need, to feel something beyond the ordinary. The birth of respectable vice. The Victorians were masters of double lives. Publicly, they built monuments to morality, churches, schools, and societies for temperance. Privately, they indulged in everything they preached against: gambling, prostitution, and, of course, gin. The gin palace became the perfect symbol of that hypocrisy. A place that embodied sin but disguised it in elegance. It wasn't a dark, smoky dive anymore. It was a spectacle, a cathedral of vice dressed in light. And that's what made it dangerous. Reformers feared the gin palace not because it was filthy, but because it was beautiful. Vice wrapped in ugliness could be shunned, but vice wrapped in art, in mirrors, brass, and chandeliers, could seduce. That lesson, too, never left Britain. From the opulent clubs of Soho to the neon-lit bars of Shoreditch, the country learned to make sin look sophisticated. It wasn't about drinking anymore. It was about presentation. Respectable vice became a cornerstone of British identity. The idea that one could indulge, so long as it was done tastefully. The psychological escape. But beneath the moral debates and class struggles was something more human. A kind of collective exhaustion. London was a machine. By the mid-1800s, it was the beating industrial heart of the world, loud, dirty, relentless. The gin palaces offered something the city could not silence in the noise, warmth in the fog, illusion in the cold. People came not only to drink, but to disappear. To step out of their own lives, even for a moment. The mirrors that lined the walls weren't just decoration. They were portals. They multiplied the light, the laughter, the illusion of plenty. And for an hour or two, a dock worker could see himself reflected as a gentleman, a maid could see herself as a lady, and London, cruel, hungry London, seemed almost kind. That need to vanish inside the glow of nightlife is still alive today. The modern bar, the nightclub, the cocktail lounge, they are all descendants of the gin palace. Each one promises the same thing. Step inside, and the world outside will wait. The legacy in stone and spirit, a few of the old gin palaces still stand. Some have been restored as heritage pubs, others turned into boutiques or cafes. But if you look closely, you'll recognize the bones. The mirrored walls, the brass railings, the curved glass windows still catching the light like liquid gold. They are ghosts made solid, whispering to every passerby. We were the beginning. And in a sense they were. The modern British pub, the cocktail bar, even the global gin revival, all trace their roots back to those loud, shimmering rooms where the poor sought warmth and the city sought escape. Every bottle of gin today carries that history within it. The juniper, the coriander, the citrus, flavors once used to mask the cheapness of the alcohol, now celebrated as luxury. What was once desperation has become identity. Britain sells its former shame as sophistication, and the world drinks it gladly. The irony of civilization, that's the strange genius of history. It cleanses its sins with time. The same empire that feared gin's corruption would later export it across the world. Colonial officers mixed it with quinine to fight malaria, and accidentally created the gin and tonic. The demon drink became the drink of empire, then the drink of nostalgia, and finally, the drink of culture. But somewhere beneath the ice cubes and designer bottles, the truth still stirs. Gin was never about elegance. It was about survival, a clear liquid that held the darkness of an age. The gin palaces may be gone, but their soul lives on. In the laughter that echoes through every London bar, in the glitter of glass under dim light, in the unspoken understanding that every drink holds a story, the story of escape, the story of illusion, the story of a city that learned to hide its sorrow in a glass and call it art. London, in the end, always forgets, but it never truly lets go. Walk its streets at night, and you'll feel it. The faint hum beneath the asphalt, the vibration of laughter and loss echoing through the stones. It's the heartbeat of the old gin palaces, still pulsing beneath the city like a memory that refuses to die. The ghost light, they say if you pass through Holborn or Clerkenwell after midnight, you might catch a flicker of gold in an abandoned window, a phantom reflection, as though a chandelier once again trembled with light. Some swear they've heard music too, a faint piano, a woman's laugh, the clink of unseen glasses. The gin palaces are gone, but their ghosts are patient. They haunt not out of malice, but nostalgia. They linger because they love this city, and because the city, deep down, loved them back. The city that learned to dream London was never a city of rest. It was, and remains, a city of dreamers and drifters, workers and wanderers, souls chasing warmth through endless fog. The gin palaces were its first dream machines. They taught Londoners how to escape not with ships or fortunes, but with light and illusion. When the factory bell rang and the streets filled with soot and shouts, the gin palaces opened their doors like theatres, promising a little heaven for a few pennies. And that, perhaps, was their truest gift. They made art out of survival. They turned the misery of the masses into a kind of glowing poetry. Even now, London thrives on that same alchemy, turning pain into performance, hardship into culture, and vice into beauty. The modern descendants step into a modern gin bar in Shoreditch, or Soho, or Covent Garden. The bottles line the shelves like jewels. The air smells of citrus and juniper. Laughter bubbles through the music. But look closer, and you'll see the same dance, the same hunger. The barmaid's smile still hides exhaustion. The drinker's laughter still masks loneliness. The lights are electric now, but they serve the same purpose: to soften reality, to blur the edges of truth. The gin palaces may have died, but the world they created never did. We simply gave it a new name: nightlife. The great illusion every age believes: it is wiser than the last. But perhaps the Victorians understood something we've forgotten: that people will always need illusions. Not because they're weak, but because reality is too sharp to face unguarded. The gin palace gave them that: a mirror to dream in, a light to chase, a drink to forget. And in that forgetting, they found a strange kind of peace. It wasn't moral, it wasn't noble, but it was human. The last toast, if you listen closely to the murmur of London's rain, the rumble of its trains, you might still hear the whisper of a toast carried through the centuries: to survival, to illusion, to the beautiful lie that kept us alive. Because in a city built on ambition and exhaustion, the gin palaces were the only places that asked for nothing: no titles, no wealth, no virtue. Only the willingness to step into the light and let it wash away the dark. For a few coins, you could buy a small eternity, a moment of belonging, a fleeting sense that life, no matter how cruel, could still shimmer. The curtain falls by dawn, the ghosts retreat. The laughter fades into the hum of buses and the hiss of rain on cobblestone. The city wakes, pretending it has forgotten. But somewhere, in the gleam of a shop window, in the smell of gin on someone's breath, the memory flickers again. A reminder that beauty and ruin were once the same thing. The chandeliers may have dimmed, but their light lives on in every mirror that catches London's sky, in every hand that lifts a glass against the weight of the world. Epilogue: the soul of the city, the story of the gin palaces, isn't really about alcohol. It's about what people do when the world grows too heavy. It's about how a city learns to carry its pain, not by denying it, but by dressing it in light and laughter. So the next time you walk through London at night, when the pubs are glowing and the rain paints halos on the pavement, remember the palaces beneath your feet. Remember the barmaids and the dreamers, the poets and the drunks, the lonely and the defiant. They built something that outlasted them all, not in stone, but in spirit. Because every city needs a place to hide its heartbreak. And for London, once upon a time, that place was filled with mirrors, music, and the sweet, dangerous scent of gin.